All right, now today is the United Nations Day of Cooperatives. The theme this year is Co-ops for Decent Work. We take a look at the culture gaining momentum in our communities of destroying facilities when there are quarrels with the municipality. We further talk about workplace stress and a demoralized labor force. But in studio with me this evening is industrial psychologist Bulelwa Rulashe joining me. But we also, of course, from the Department of Labour's Compensation Fund, we're joined by Vuyo Mafata. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with yourself, Bulelwa. I mean, you are an industrial psychologist. I'm sure you deal a lot with, the mental health of employees in the workplace. Generally, how are workers feeling at work?
Well, there's a range of things currently taking place because you find there's the reality of the stress that's brought about by the economy, and there's also the stress of just people living. So there's a lot that people are having to carry, and the reality that people are losing jobs, and there is pressure at work because with retrenchments, there's also organizations that are saying, let's do lots more with fewer and fewer people.
Right. And Vuyo, are companies training employees? I mean, when it comes to, making sure that there are safety awareness practices, they're complying, but most importantly, also making sure that the HR department is capable in handling any stress or mental health issues that, the employees may go through.
Well, there is a requirement for companies to train workers on first aid issues. And with regard to when you're talking about issues around workplace stress and so on, there is a requirement if that information comes to light and a person requires some kind of a medical attention, it is a requirement that the employers would then need to report such instances to the department's compensation fund, and they would then also have to send a person to a treating practitioner who can be able to provide reports that can help support a claim if there's a claim that is submitted.
Right. And Bulelwa, is the HR department the go-to department? I mean, in terms of expressing whatever that you're feeling, whatever demotivation you're feeling, because at times, companies or employers don't understand why a certain employee is not performing, but perhaps, issues and dialogues around mental health or even stress are not encouraged in the workplace. You just have to get to work and do your job and leave your problems at the gate, they say.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is that there's two perspectives to this. You find there are people who believe that, yes, the HR department is the go-to place, and that has a lot to do with more individual kind of relationships. Do I trust this person?
Yes.
If I go and I open up and I say what really bothers me beyond the work environment, is my staff safe? Or is that possibly going to catch up with me later? Or there are people who say, you know what, there's no ways I'm going there because I can't trust these individuals because everything that I say, it finds its way to my manager. And sometimes the kind of relationship that I have with my manager, it doesn't allow me to actually feel that safe to say stuff that really bothers me.
Right.
So it becomes a very tricky balance to manage in the work context.
Sure. All right. So we're talking about, more of the stress, more of the mental health, but also there's the physical strain that employees can feel while on the job. What are some of the steps that employees need to take? Should they be injured at work? Should they feel physical strain at work? Where do they go to? And is there a process to follow?
Well, as soon as they experience that or they come across such, they then need to report it to the employer. The law says that the employer doesn't have to believe that the person is been injured or is going through some mental issues or stress issues. They then have an obligation to report the occupational disease or the injury, if it is an injury that has taken place. They then have an obligation to report it to the compensation commissioner. And it's the compensation commissioner who will then make a decision based on the medical reports that will be submitted.
Right.
By the physician or the health practitioner that the employee would have been referred to.
But what happens then if the company doesn't comply with that process? What happens if they don't comply with some of the national policies which the Department of Labour have set out for every company to have, especially in that particular incident where there is physical strain or even stress?
Well, one is so that the employee gets attention. If within 7 days the employer has not, they need to notify within 7 days. Right? If the employer doesn't come to the department and report the incident, the employee can go to a nearest Department of Labour office and report the incident. We will then dispatch our inspectors who would then go to the employer, and some of the responsibilities they have then is to make sure that they then compel the employer using the enforcement mechanisms that are available within the law
Right.
for the employer to register and report such incidents. And failing which, then there are some enforcement mechanisms that would then be triggered, which may end up also leading to prosecution if the employer is found to have contravened legislation.
Right. And Bulula, I know that you also consult with a lot of companies in terms of giving them advice on how to deal with such incidents in the workplace. What is your engagement? What advice do you give to companies?
When it comes to?
When it comes to stress, when it comes to dealing with employees, when it comes to also following processes, because I can imagine that perhaps it's one that they may neglect or take for granted, given that it's a professional setting. You have to come here, just do your work and leave your problems at home and not let that interfere with your work.
I think what's really good is that a lot of companies also have wellness departments. And so you find that oftentimes when you pick up that somebody is going through stress, you do refer them. Sometimes people would feel safer telling you their stuff not in the work environment. They might call you after work and they would say, this is what is bothering me currently. Yeah. And then you refer them to a wellness professional outside of the work context. Because also you find that where there are mechanisms to report, say there is a line that a person can call and it's supposed to be anonymous, people have sometimes felt that in as much as if it's anonymous, I find that somehow that information gets to my manager. And therefore, it's safer for me to consult outside of the work context.
Right.
So it becomes a good practice when you've got a well-established wellness center within the organization, but also you do find sometimes because of that safety risk, people sometimes opting to go outside of the work environment.
So you're saying that confidentiality is of importance in this regard, especially when dealing with your employees' wellness?
Very much so, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to ensure that your people can bring off their best selves in the work context. Yeah. We want productivity at its highest level. But if you feel that you can't bring your full self to the work environment, there's no ways you can be as productive as you should be.
Well, because today is also the UN, cooperative, sort of day, Vuyo, what do you hope most companies can take note, given that today aims to highlight so many of the issues and also some of the challenges that are present in the workplace?
Well, one, the safety of workers is important, irrespective of the type of corporation that you are, or the size of corporation, or the number of employees that you employ. And I think all the employers, as employers, we have a responsibility to make sure that, one, there is safe workplace practices that we employ. Compliance to the occupational health and safety legislation is quite important. And in an event that there are those safety measures, but there's breaches where people get injured, employers also have an obligation to make sure that the workers' claims are registered and that they get adequate medical care, to ensure that when they do come back to work, they don't have some of the issues that may be stressful and lead to other kind of diseases like post-traumatic stress disorders and so on.
Yeah, and I understand that most of the responsibility is placed on the employer, but what are some of the responsibilities on employees? Because, generally, I would like to assume that at times you find, someone gets excited about getting a job, but do they really read through the contract? Are they familiar with the policies, of the company that they employed to? Do they understand that there are processes to follow? Of course, should they be injured, and what do they need to do to follow through? Because at times I think we take it for granted that it's just the employer's responsibility, but what's the employer's responsibility here as well?
Well, the one is they need to make sure that they are aware of what their rights are in the workplace. I think that's very important, because oftentimes employees don't know what their rights are in the workplace, and as a result, when these rights get abused, they don't know where to turn to and how to get these addressed. So they have a very important responsibility to make sure that they know.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also want to put in the employees' perspective here and talk about them. What initiatives do they need to take? We know that South Africa, I think I'm seeing a growing, light in terms of talking about mental health issues. I see it on social media. It's becoming, quite a norm now to talk about it. But for those who may still feel like they don't want to sort of entertain feelings or emotions of stress or emotions of feeling depressed and just go to work, what would your advice be to them in terms of taking action and dealing with what they're going through so that it doesn't affect their performance at work?
I think little things like the gym, it does help. And I think also having somebody that is your go-to person. I think we often underestimate the informal circles and people who are ready and available to help and support us. And I think because of the pressure of social media, we often forget that there are people who are still genuine, who are authentic, who are sincere, who can provide a shoulder to lean on. And when he talks about safety, we often think about physical safety. We don't think about emotional safety. Yeah. How do we speak to each other? How do peers speak to each other? Because we often think that I'm not safe physically, I'm not safe from the abuse from my manager. But sometimes even peers, the way people speak to each other, I guess because of the pressure sometimes, right. But people forget what it means to be humane these days. Yeah. So I think also just to notice, I mean, you know those kind of friends who would normally be available and talkative, and when you see somebody suddenly withdrawn, what is your responsibility as a friend, as a family member? Do you take the time to reach out and to say, you know, I care, I notice that you're not available, I notice you're not communicating that much. What's up? Can we go for a coffee? So sometimes it's those little things. And also self-care, hey? The way we eat is also important. So sometimes we think it's really expensive to go to the gym and sign up for membership. It doesn't always have to go to that extent. Just going for a walk when you get back from work, get into the house, change into something comfortable, right. Go for a 30-minute walk around the block, come back, have conversations with your children, have conversations with people, you know, in your social circles. Mm-hmm. And that usually takes away a lot of the stress. Talk about things that don't involve money, you know, the less serious kind of stuff. And it does relieve you of stress if you take the time to use those mechanisms. Yeah,
and I also suppose even employees have responsibilities towards one another, Vuyo. Yes. I mean, if you were to work in an environment where you can foresee that, you know, perhaps there aren't security and safety measures in place, you have to report that. That is your responsibility. Even with our reporter today, Yanka Tome, talking to us about the fires from the police floods. Some of the residents said there weren't any fire extinguishers, actually, you know, seen in the building. How then do employees take responsibility and report, you know, those cases to the employer?
Well, one of the responsibilities of the employer is they need to make sure that the employees are trained with regard to occupational health and safety, because they have to have safety reps in the workplace. And it's their responsibility then to make sure that the employer keeps the workplace safe and they comply with the relevant regulations and legislation. And if the employer doesn't, nothing stops the workers from going to any labor center and report to an inspector that they have reason to believe that they may not be safe in the workplace, so that the department can then send the occupational health and safety inspectors to inspect the workplace.
I want to also talk about just another issue that we've seen, I'm sure, in the media with regards to protests happening in Katlehong. We've seen, of course, a primary school being, you know, destroyed, and also the MEC of Education in Gauteng, Mr. Panyaza Lesufi, saying that he actually distanced himself from fixing the schools because communities have a responsibility towards, you know, the infrastructure that is provided to them, especially by government. Let's talk about the role of communities in that instance. Obviously, these are disgruntled members of the community. And Sisbulele, because you are a psychologist, how do you advise to better deal with, you know, some of the issues that we have, even in our communities? Because this is clearly a projection of frustrations from community members who are protesting for lack of electricity. But are there better ways of dealing with that besides showing that emotion through demolishing and destroying schools?
I seriously believe that as a country we've got one major problem. At some point, the way to express anger was to do exactly these things. We didn't get to a place post-1994 where we actually spoke about how to unlearn some of these behaviors. So you find that what we adopted way back then, post-apartheid, we did not engage to say, let us find a better way of engaging about things that don't make us happy. Let us talk, let us debrief, let us engage. Because what worries me, when we see people burning down properties, what we don't realize, there's a child who's watching me do that. Yeah. There is someone who's looking at me as a role model. Guess what happens to that child? In 10 years, 15 years, they're going to do the same thing. So how do we actually start in the home environment to unlearn some of these things? What are the conversations that we need to have where it matters the most? Because remember, you are not who you are because of just the community. Right. Someone said something in the home environment that shaped who you are. So I think we need to start there, engage our communities and talk, find a way to create a culture of talking through things than being aggressive as a way of expressing our anger.
Yeah.
It doesn't take us forward. It takes us backward, because a school that's burnt down, that is a huge resource that is gone. And what does that do then to that community? They have one less school, they have one less library, and so on and so on. And so what are we saying to these children who are watching us do these things? We need to unlearn expressing anger through aggression.
Right, and not only our children, Vuyo, who obviously went to the school affected, but also the teachers who that was their primary place of employment are now affected, because now they have no way to go and, obviously provide for their families. I suppose even from the Department of Labour's perspective, how can even workers who may have, participated in the protest better deal with issues, especially involving them not being happy with perhaps, let's say, service delivery?
Well, I think one of the things we encourage is dialogue. I think there's better ways to solve issues in the workplace than violence. And I think dialogue is one of the most important mechanisms that should be used to discuss issues between workers and the employers.
All right. Thank you so much, Vuyo, for joining us. This Bulelwa. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thanks to you too, Tumelo.
All right, then. Well, that was Bulelwa Rulashe and Vuyo Mafata, of course, joining us this evening to talk more about the UN's Cooperative Day, and also highlighting some of the issues that we, of course, see in the workplace.